Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Ikra bismi rabbika allazi khalaq, khalaqal insana min alaq. Ikra wa rabbukal akram, allazi allama bil qalam. Allaman insana ma lam ya'lam. Qalla innal insana la yazqa. Arrahu staghna. Inna illa rabbika raja. In the name of the Lord, the entirely merciful, the entirely beneficent, recite in the name of your Lord who created man from a clinging substance. Recite, and your Lord is the most generous, who taught by the pen, taught man that which he did not know. No, but indeed man transgresses, because he sees himself self-sufficient. Indeed, to your Lord is your return. Assalamu alaikum, everybody, and welcome to the Islamic Human Rights Commission conference on Islamophobia. The title, of course, being Is the Sun Setting on the Western Empire? Exploring Shifts in Global Power and Islamophobic Thinking. My name is Professor Saeed Khan, and it is my honor to serve to introduce you to today's plenary sessions, which will feature keynote speakers, panelists, as well as, inshallah, a very robust session of questions and answers. I welcome all of you who are joining us live today, and thank you for that. And I also thank you for those who will be tuning in later, who perhaps will not be able to catch us in real time, but will be able to do so with the recorded and the archive sessions. And of course, those of you who are tuning in live can, inshallah, also benefit from watching these again. With that, we'd like to move then into our first session of the day, which takes a look at Muslims at the periphery of the West. What will the shifts bode for them? And this panel is essentially examining what those Muslims who live outside of the so-called Western world, elsewhere in the Islamicate, are going to be dealing with as these shifts happen in real time regarding the West, its anxieties, its efforts to try to maintain the status quo through either defiance, resistance, or even force and violence, and to then explore what options Muslims may find themselves when confronting these challenges, either brand new ones or ones that are exacerbated and amplified existing ones. Our chair for the first session is Seyfeddin Kara, who is the Marie Sklodowska-Curie Global Fellow at the University of Toronto. He's also a board member of the American Council for the Study of Islamic Societies. Dr. Kara previously was a teaching fellow at the University of Durham in Great Britain and assistant professor and the Imam Ali Chair at the Hartford Seminary in Connecticut in the United States. He's published research articles in the Journal of Near East Studies, the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society, the Muslim World, and Journal of Muslim Minority Affairs. He is the author of In Search of Ali ibn Talib's Codex, History and Traditions of the Earliest Copy of the Quran, and he's currently writing a monograph on the textual integrity of the Quran. Joining us from Toronto, Ontario, Canada, Dr. Seyfeddin Kara. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum, Saeed. Thank you very much for this very nice introduction. I'd like to thank, first of all, the organizing committee for this conference, Arzu and you and the others, and as well as the Decolonial International Network, Scotland Against Criminalizing Communities, and the Islamic Human Rights Commission. We have very distinguished speakers for this panel, the competition and the Muslims at the periphery of the West. What will the shifts bode for them? And we are having we are hoping to have a very rich and interesting conversation, starting with the keynote speakers. I would like to first introduce Olsi Jazexhi, who is an Albanian Canadian historian, and teaches Russian, Ottoman, and Muslim nations modern history at International University of Malaysia. He has previously taught history at University of Alexander Moisi of Durrës and Alexander João University of Elbasan in Albania. His research interest covers the Balkans and Muslim communities in ex-Ottoman space, Russia and Mujahideen al-Halq terrorist organization, nationalism in Southeastern Europe, and the situation of Muslims in China. Olsi, floor is yours. You have 20 minutes.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me well? Because I think I'm having some issues with the internet. How is my voice? Seyfeddin? All right, I presume, okay. Can you hear me now? It's fine, okay, so you can hear me, good. All right, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for extending this invitation to me. Today I'm going to speak about Muslims in the Balkans between the myth of the Russian threat, Islamic terrorism, and Judeo-American domination. Now, as many of you might know, Islam was prohibited for the majority of Muslims in the Balkans during the Cold War because we were under Soviet domination. However, with the end of the Cold War in the 1990s and the victory of the West over the Soviet bloc, Islam started to be practiced freely in the Balkan Peninsula. While in ex-Yugoslavia, Islam was practiced during the Cold War, in countries like Albania, it was totally prohibited. With the collapse of communism in the 1990s, we in the Balkans have witnessed a revival of Islam. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, in Kosovo, in Macedonia, in Montenegro, in Albania as well, we had the birth of a new Islam, which in a way, thanks to Saudi money, was in most of the cases influenced by Saudi and Salafi doctrine. Now, as many of you might know, the 1990s were a violent time for the people of the Balkans. We had the disintegration of Yugoslavia, and during the disintegration of Yugoslavia and the emergence of new nation states, we had Muslim communities who were victimized. We had the Bosnian War from 92 to 95 and the Kosovo War from 1998 to 1999. In these military conflicts, Muslim communities were targeted by Christian nationalist groups, be them Croats, be them Serbs, or in some cases even Montenegrins. The war against Yugoslavia, which was orchestrated by the West, in a way made a kind of theological revolution for the Muslims of the Balkans. While communism in a way had served in a way to cool the religious tensions in the Balkans, the crimes which were committed by Serbian and Croat chauvinists in a way pushed the Muslims of the Balkans to have a new understanding about themselves. Now, while in 1990s, the Americans who took over the Balkans from the Soviets, they in a way built alliances with Muslims. They needed Islam in order of fighting against communism. With the beginning of the 21st century and the 9/11 attacks, Islam from an ally of the West will become an enemy of the West. The first decade of the 21st century will be a decade of NATO's expansion in Eastern Europe. And in the Balkans, in 2004, we'll have Bulgaria and Romania join NATO. In 2009, we will have Albania and Croatia join NATO as well. This process will reach its climax in 2017 and 2020, when Montenegro and Northern Macedonia will join the American-led alliance. But the beginning of the 21st century with attacks and George Bush II war against terrorism, which was in a way a war against Islam. The global war which the United States government will launch against the Islamic world will impact even the Muslim communities in the Balkans. Now, in the first decade of the 21st century, we will have many Muslims, be them Bosnians or Albanians, because the two major communities that are Muslim in the Balkans are Albanians and Bosnians. So we will have many Albanian and Bosnians who, educated in the Islamic world, they will come back to their home countries, and they will try in a way to revive the Islamic identity of our people. However, the start of the war on terror by the Americans will target even the Muslim communities in Albania, in Kosovo, and in Macedonia. During the first decade of the 21st century, the main enemy of the American administration in the Balkans will be the Ikhwani Muslimin, or the Muslim Brotherhood group, and the Wahhabi and Salafi Islam. The Americans, who during the first decade of the 21st century will identify Islam as one of their major enemies for world domination, will put in their map Islamophobia on the communities of the Balkan Peninsula. The Muslim community of Albania, the Islamic Religious Union of the Republic of Macedonia, the Islamic community of Kosovo, which serve in a way as the official churches of Islam in the Balkans, will be targeted by US embassies and local security services. For people who have followed the media and the developments in the Muslim communities in the first decade of the 21st century, they know very well the huge propaganda which the Americans, with the local governments, will organize against the so-called radical Islam and radicalized Muslims. Albanian and in many cases Bosnian educated Muslims who were educated in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt, in Jordan, in Syria, in Iran, in Lebanon, in Libya, etc., will be targeted as possible radicals by US embassies which operated between Skopje, Tirana, and Sarajevo. In the case of Albania in particular, where the structure of Islam was very fragile because of the communist past, the Americans were very successful to remove from the structures of Sunni Islam Albanian Muslim scholars who were educated in the Arab world and in Iran. In the year 2003 and after that, the American think tank Rand Corporation in the United States produced a number of papers where it was suggesting to the United States governments how they had to deal with Muslims and Islam in order of creating a US Israeli-friendly Islam. In their papers, the RAND Corporation suggested, among others, that the Americans had to support the Fethullah Gulen movement as a movement which in this case was underlined as a movement friendly to US imperialism, which rejected authoritarian regimes that would impose strict controls on ideas and which was very critical of the regimes in Iran and Saudi Arabia. In the case of Albania, since 2003, the Gulenists were deployed by the Albanian government with the support of the US embassy in Tirana to take over the infrastructure of Sunni Islam. In the case of Albania, Sunni Islam is administered by the Muslim community of Albania. In the 1990s, during the time when Islam witnessed a rebirth in the country, we had many Egyptian, Jordanian, Saudi, Iranian NGOs which came in Albania and helped the Muslim community to rebuild itself, to open many madrasas, to construct new mosques, and to teach to the Albanians the religion that communism had prohibited for them. But what will happen from 2003 and onwards, the American embassy in collaboration with the Albanian governments, they will close many of these NGOs, and in a way, they will kill the Muslim civil society, and they will give the keys of infrastructure of the Sunni Islam in Albania to the Gulenist network. Now, from the year 2001 until 2016, the major enemy of US administrations in the Balkans has been Sunni Islam. Sunni Islam became very problematic for American policymakers between 2011 and 2014, when many Sunni Muslims were radicalized by American, Saudi, Qatari, and sometimes even Turkish medias to join the fake jihad against the Syrian government. Hundreds of Muslims from Albania, from Kosovo, from Northern Macedonia, from Bosnia, joined terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, while many other Muslims sympathized with the Muslim Brotherhood revolution in Egypt. This politicization and, in a way, militarization of many Muslims worried the Americans a lot, and as a result, from 2013 to 2016, there was a very aggressive campaign by Albanian, Macedonian, and Kosovar governments. All these movements were, of course, coordinated by US embassies in the region to target the so-called radicals among Muslim communities. As a result, hundreds of Muslims who were arrested, jailed, in
Apologies, I think there's some technical issue. I don't know if Olsi is going to be able to make it back. So I'd like to move on to the next speaker. If he's João, if he's available. Can you unmute yourself, please?
I was muted. Hello, everyone. Assalamu alaikum.
Yes, Assalamu alaikum.
Can you hear me?
Yes, very well. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much for the invite. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yes, I'd like to just introduce you quickly. João Silva Jordão is a Muslim convert and political activist and a PhD candidate in urbanism. He has a particular interest in trying to analyze modern problems using the timeless paradigm that is Islam. In his activism, he takes particular interest in studying mechanisms that allow for the generation of more just cities and develop mechanisms for the incremental verticalization of city centers. Yes, floor is yours, João, and you have 20 minutes to present your talk.
Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you for the invite. I have prepared a really lengthy PowerPoint presentation. I think that would maybe you have control over the screen. Maybe you can share it. It is very long, so I might ask to skip, obviously, to the next slide if I feel like I'm running out of time. A small note before I begin. What I'm presenting here today is at the same time a sort of a piece of geopolitical analysis, of course, in political analysis, but it is also a highly speculative scenario that I'm putting forth, okay? So I do want you to take that into consideration. I think speculation is necessary. You know, when we, let's say, when we engage in a research project, we begin with a hypothesis that's bound to be at least partially speculative. So I hope, even though the daunting scenario that I hope doesn't indeed take place, even if it doesn't take place, I would like to think that the presentation I have for you today is still useful insofar as it will have some elements that perhaps aren't usually discussed. So if we could begin the presentation, I think I will try and concentrate. It is quite text heavy. I will try and concentrate mainly on the maps, okay? So there's a lot of maps, a lot of schemes, and I'll try and explain to you the general logic I think this is the, I do apologize, I think this is the wrong PowerPoint presentation. Would it be possible for me to share my screen? Sorry, I think that's David Miller's presentation. It's okay, either way, I will begin a short introduction regardless. So the idea that I have for you today is what I call the Northern Megastate. The Northern Megastate is a very simple idea. It's the idea that if you look at the global map, we already have a tendency for certain powers to be centralized. So Europe used to be highly divided. And now it is coming together slowly but surely as a sort of federal state. Let us remember that a lot of trade, so the European Union already acts in a lot of ways like a federal state, okay? So a lot of trade agreements, foreign policy already goes through the European Union. Meanwhile, in the North America, you have, you know, Canada and the United States of America that are already united by a lot of treaties. If you basically add the federal states of the United States of America, the European Union, and eventually, and this is where it becomes a bit speculative, the Russian Federation. I just want you to imagine that you would have a geopolitical force that, if you consider the short space, imagine you build a bridge between Alaska and Siberia. You can have an almost continuous landmass from Lisbon to New York the other way around, okay? Not via the Atlantic, but the other way around, okay? And what I'll try to demonstrate today is that even though this possibility seems completely far-fetched, in the medium to long term, this is a scenario that we could have to contend with, okay? So I think we're having a little bit of a problem with a PowerPoint presentation. That is fine. As you'll notice, I do speak a lot and quite fast, so do stop me if you have any questions or clarifications. So this Northern Megastate idea follows as such. If you look at the EEZ, and this is one of the things that I really wanted to show you in the PowerPoint presentation, if you look at the EEZ, which is the Economic Exclusive Zone of the European Union, it basically joins together every single member of the European Union. Now imagine that Portugal has the Azores and the Madeira. Mind you, if you have a little rock in the middle of the Atlantic, if you have a little rock in the middle of the Pacific, anywhere, that you can consider to be land of your own, you have, I think it's about 150 to 200 kilometers each way. Okay, hence the importance of these little battles over these little tiny islands in the South China Sea. Thank you so much. If we could go maybe to skip straight to maybe the second or third slide introduction, we can go through. This is what I've done right now. And if we can go to the first map of the EEZ, which just to give you a little perspective of the jurisdiction of the political constructions we are talking about here. So I call this the northern megastate danger, an ultra dystopian possibility. If we could stop right here, thank you so much, Dawood. This is a representation of the economic exclusive zone of the European Union. Okay, this is the jurisdiction over the seas of European Union alone. Unfortunately, the maps available still include the United Kingdom. And maybe I'll mention this. Have you noticed how a lot of the Muslims in the UK, the tendency was to say, well, Brexit was led by right-wingers, racist right-wingers. And of course, Brexit was led by somewhat racist right-wingers. But sometimes we have to think, how does this affect Islam and geopolitically? And I would even say, to a degree, Brexit was a very interesting phenomena that basically made this huge sort of European Union empire just a little bit smaller, if you will. And sometimes we can maybe even see that not necessarily as a positive thing, but as a factor to take into consideration. If we go to the next slide, we see basically the same, but comparing it to the other EEZs, okay? To the other in blue, the other economic exclusive zones with the dark blue being the European Unions. Now, just imagine if you add this blue to the United States of America's EEZ, I haven't added the maps of the United States of America's EEZ and the Russian EEZ, but it is really quite massive. So imagine a political construction that can join all these states together, okay? And by the way, the reason why you see these dots all over the earth is because of French outre-mer regions, as they call them. So it really is a key cog in the imperialist machine, not least because at least France, for example, can park their nuclear submarines pretty much all over the world, striking any place at will. So these things are really important. If we could go to the next slide, I'll show you something that people are not aware of. This is the maximum expansion plans of the European Union. As you can see, it includes Russia, okay? I'm not saying we're going to see Russia and the European Union anytime soon. I certainly would not expect it, okay? But this is just a representation of, imagine if all countries that could potentially join the European Union did join the European Union. This is their economic exclusive zone. If this doesn't scare you, if this doesn't look like a daunting prospect, I don't know what is. If we could go to the next slide, please. I'm going to give you now, and again, I'm not saying that Russia is anywhere close to joining the West, but I will give you some instances of previous Western-Russian alliances. So there was a very lengthy Franco-British Russian alliance, if we go to the next slide, that lasted for, I think, 10 to 20 years. It was very lengthy. And if you notice, there was also the Ribbentrop Pact signed between the Soviet Union and the Nazis. And if you notice, there have been many, many instances, and we'll go into a little bit more detail, in which the Russian Federation displays exactly the same Islamophobic and imperialistic tendencies toward the Islamic world, and sometimes to an even worse degree than the West. If we could go to the next slide, I do have a lot of material. So now I'm going to present you an idea that is a little bit controversial, which is that the war in Ukraine can be interpreted as what I call an Orwellian war. Now, if we go to the next slide, I'm not obviously saying that the Russian invasion of Ukraine isn't real. When I speak about an Orwellian war, I'm speaking about the extent to which here, from on our side of the pond, we're always being told that Russia is the worst enemy of the West, and that the invasion of Ukraine is terrible. We're going to wage all-out war to defend Ukraine. But at the end of the day, do you really think this is going to develop into an all-out war between NATO and Russia? Let me just read you a little bit of a part of George Orwell's 1984 that I really like to look at in order to interpret some of these wars. He said, insofar as the war, this is obviously his description of how in a world where you have these three huge geopolitical blocks that basically ally amongst each other and fight each other, and they tell their own population that they hate each other and that they're in all-out war. But really what happens is that they're tacit agreements behind the background that make it so that the superpowers never infringe in each other's territory. And this is exactly how the Ukraine war has been playing out, not since 2022, since 2014, let us remember, because that is when the civil war started. And the civil war started, by the way, when a pro-Russian president canceled a trade deal with the European Union, which then led the European Union to activate Nazi militias on the ground, namely Svoboda, and now the Azov Battalion, to start a civil war in a country that is now being used by both sides, Russia and NATO, to test new weapons and oppress the local population. This is dire. Let us look at what Orwell said in his book. Insofar as the war has a direct economic purpose, is it a war of manpower? It is for possession of these densely populated regions and the northern ice sheet that three powers are constantly fighting. In practice, no single power controls the entire disputed area. Portions of it are constantly changing hands, and this is the opportunity to seize this or that piece of land through the sudden stroke of betrayal that dictates the endless shifts of alliances. The inhabitants of these areas, reduced more or less openly to the condition of slaves, pass continually from conqueror to conqueror and are spent like much coal or oil in the race to produce more armaments, to capture more territory, to control more force of work, to the production of more armaments, to capture more territory, and so on and so on. Note that the struggle never goes beyond the border of the disputed areas. If we could go to the next slide, please. I'm going to give you other instances of relatively recent Orwellian wars. The Korean War, the Vietnam War. Were those not Orwellian wars where the capitalist bloc and the communist bloc used countries and territories other than their own to try and fight over their own influence and play little geopolitical games, never infringing in each other's territory? And is that not what was happening in Syria right now also? Or now it's called the war in Syria has calmed down somewhat. Was that not the story of the Syrian war? We can obviously thank Russia, and it's obviously that Russia has played a part in counterbalancing since the end of the Second World War the huge power of the United States of America, and maybe that's a good thing. Instead of having a unipolar world, we have a sort of we already have a sort of duopoly insofar as the nuclear armament at least goes. But the truth is that these two superpowers have been using countries like Ukraine and Syria to fight a very cynical war, testing new weapons, acquiring new resources. So if we go to the next slide, I discuss these other relatively recent Orwellian wars in which you have these geopolitical behemoths using other people's countries and territories to expand their influence and test their weapons, which is perverse, at the very least, I think, as we could say. If we could go to the next slide, please. Well, China was very much involved in some of those Orwellian wars in Korea and Vietnam. Does that prevent future alliances or pacts between these two powers? Of course not. Let's look at the China-USA case study, another very good example of two so-called geopolitical enemies, which are anything but. They're rivals at best. If we could go to the next slide. This is just a representation of all the different. If we go to the next slide, maybe there's one where look at the trade. I mean, how can we possibly say that China is a geopolitical enemy of the United States of America? They're in the top 3 trading partners. If we look at who trades the most with the United States of America, how can they be enemies? How can this possibly be the case? They're in the top 3, with the other 2 being the countries that the United States of America shares a border with, and far from 4th place. They're in 3rd place, but far off 4th. That means there's a lot of people with a lot of power and a lot of money from both sides that profit off each other, and a huge amount of economic dependence. Now, the China case is paradoxical because indeed, my contention is that if the scenario of the northern megastate is to happen, which is basically a sort of entente, tacit agreement, or even direct military alliance between Russia and the European Union and the United States of America's federal government, it is precisely to placate the rise of other countries, but which have other cultures which are a little bit more distinct, ethnic makeups that are a little bit more distinct, linguistic makeups that are a little bit more distinct. And even though obviously Russia has been a rival, at least, of the West for a very long time, they do share perhaps some cultural elements, linguistic elements, ethnic elements, and geographical elements, because at the end of the day, and I mentioned this before and I'll go back into it, Russia is part of what we call, or at least Western Russia is part of what we call the Great European Plain, which is a pretty much interrupted massive land from France to Moscow and the areas around Moscow. Okay, so if I contend that it is possible that this northern megastate, which would again be a sort of reuniting of Russia with Western Europe and and the United States of America. It is precisely because of the rise of China and other such countries. It's almost as if instead of the rise of the BRICS, the rise of the BICS could perhaps push Russia and Western Europe back together. If we could go to the next slide, I go into some details. As you can see, this is it's just a small example of a hugely profound deal that was signed. Interesting enough, a couple of years before the pandemic started, which is interesting, where China and the United States of America and other countries, part of the G20, signed a lot of treaties pertaining to common sustainable development goals. Isn't that interesting? But perhaps that's a theme to cover when we discuss the pandemic one time, maybe. If we could go to the next slide, please. A little bit controversial again. I know a lot of people, like Putin and his contribution towards the defense of Syria, for example. I agree. He's definitely a cold and calculating. He's definitely a master of pragmatic realpolitik, let's say. But I think people forget that before the Western war on terror, we had Putin's war on terror. If we go to the next slide, I don't know why this event isn't talked about more. Let us remember that Putin's rise to power wasn't necessarily dependent, but had as a pivot the use of what is very possibly a false flag attack in Moscow, terrorist attacks in Moscow, bombings of residential buildings that killed Russian citizens that were promptly blamed on Chechnyan separatist groups that led to another invasion of Chechnya, more oppression of Chechnya, more death. And of course, here in the West, we're very open to interpreting this as a potential false flag because, of course, it's completely suspicious. And of course, there's plenty of evidence that it was the FSB that Putin was the leader of that undertook these bombings, blaming him on the Chechens so they could then do what they did. And I mean, the parallels with 9/11 are obvious, except that here in the West, we accept this as a potential false flag, but 9/11 we never would. I would, obviously, and a lot of people would, but the mainstream media would never go down those types of paths. There's a lot of journalists that looked into these bombings in Moscow, and a lot of them have been assassinated. I think it's 2 or 3 at least that were assassinated or who died in mysterious circumstances who were looking into these Moscow apartment building bombings. If we could go to the next slide, please. So I want to introduce, I think I'm running out of time. I'm going to try and be quick. I want to introduce to you a concept of the East-West orientation of historical empires, okay? So it might strike you as a really bit of a weird idea if I tell you that back in the day, back in the day, that there were, let's say, a tendency for a nation to expand in the east-west axis more so than north-south. Now, this might strike you as a really weird idea. This is very simple to understand because the temperature flux changes more from the north to south axis than to east to west, which means if you have, let's say, a civilization based on a certain type of agriculture, it is because it is easier for you to take over spaces that are within your own latitude, I think. If you could go to the next slide, please. I think I have to speed up. So this is just a representation of the, it's a paper by Turchin, a really brilliant piece of geopolitical analysis. If we could go to the next slide, please. And I'm presenting this idea basically as a sort of, again, a thought scenario, okay? What if this tendency for the historical makeup of empires to follow the east-west kind of axis, what if this were to somehow be revived? This tendency is a little bit less, Russia completely follows it, by the way, or somewhat follows it. But what if this were to be almost revived? And historically, this east-west axis scenario, having generated these cultural, ethnic, and linguistic similarities among these empires, what if this was to be a key factor in the political alliances of the future? This is why I'm referring to the East-West orientation of historical empires theory in this context. If we go to the next slide, please. I think we might have to speed up. I do apologize. This is just a representation that in the beginning, the Islamic expansion also very much followed this kind of East-West kind of scenario, right? Where the Hijaz, if you notice, a lot of the Maghreb and North Africa follows kind of along the same latitude than than the Hijaz, which is essentially where Islam initially came from. Though obviously today Islam's expansion kind of defeats this principle. If we go to the next slide, please. I think we can just look at the Iranian map really quickly, and then I'm going to skip forward to the conclusion. Sorry, because I think I have no more time. This is just basically a representation of how, if the Islamic world, and maybe I will more or less skip to the conclusion because I think I'm running out of time. Regardless of whether we have, and I think I won't be really referring much to the PowerPoint here. I think I really need to finish. So that map that you just saw was basically a representation of how Iran forms as a sort of geopolitical wedge between what would otherwise be a fairly continuous kind of landmass of Muslims. And so I think that regardless, and if you notice in the presentation on the right, there was a sort of a painting of a dagger almost pointing down. This is my own kind of, let's say, how should I put it, adaptation of a painting by Richard Westall called The Sword of Damocles. I say that regardless of whether this northern megastate comes into being or not, the Sword of Damocles, which can be defined, and I think I have it in this slide, can be defined as a sword, a constant threat hanging over our heads, regardless of whether Russia reconverges with the West or not. It doesn't matter because this northern megastate already exists and is called NATO. And NATO has very much operated, even though paradoxically it was meant to barricade Russia, but really the countries that it's invaded are mostly Muslim, if you look at it, which is quite interesting. So this northern megastate already exists, and we as Muslims, we do well to recognize it and act upon it. I sometimes think that we need an Islamic alliance that operates much like NATO did, and that tries to accomplish the two main objectives that NATO tried to accomplish, which is to have peace within its member states and to obviously serve as a deterrent from foreign invasions. Okay, Islamic unity at this point, or at least building proper, broad political and military alliances, is a question of survival. And I would like to leave you with this idea. Thank you very much, and I am sorry for having overrun a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you very much for being prompt with the time and for this very interesting presentation. I'm sure that there will be some questions, and this Northern Alliance and the way that they function, and I look forward to having those questions at the end of the panel. We lost Olsi because of internet connections. I think he didn't have connections, and now he's back. His computer was frozen. I would like to give him 7 minutes that he left, and then we'll move on to the next panelist. Yes, Olsi, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Seyfeddin, and my apologies for being frozen out. I don't know what happened. There is a very heavy rain here in Kuala Lumpur. Anyhow, as I was explaining before, the situation of Islam in the Balkans in 1990s witnessed a revival, but with the starting of the year 2000, in 2001, we have from the West, United States, which uses the Balkans as its colony, where Islam became an enemy of the imperial West. While in the first decade of the year 2000, it was Sunni Islam which was targeted. In the middle of the second decade of the year 2000, which means after 2015, when the NATO alliance will, in a way, crush the militant Islam from Syria to Egypt, and by extension, they will target even the local Muslim communities in the Balkans, where we will have mass imprisonment of Muslim activists, intellectuals, imams, and what have you. Since 2012, we will have a very interesting development in the Balkans. In 2012, Israeli embassy will be opened in Tirana, Albania. And since 2012, we will have Israel, which in the 1990s and early 2000s was very hostile to the Muslims, and in particular to the independence of Kosovo. We'll have Israel, which after opening its embassy will be very aggressively involved in the Balkans. Now, during the first decade of the 21st century, the Americans will target the Sunni Muslim civil society. After finishing off with the militant Sunni Islam, mainly the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafi Islam, a new enemy will be created for the United States in the Balkans, and this new enemy will be Iran. In 2012, we'll have the opening of the Israeli embassy, and in almost the same time, countries like Albania will start to freeze their relations with the Muslim world. Embassies of Pakistan and Malaysia will be closed in the country. And then 1 year after the opening of the Israeli embassy in Tirana in 2013, Albania will be asked by the Americans to host the main enemy of political Islam in the Middle East, the Mujahideen al-Halq. In 2013, US government will approach in the time the Prime Minister of Albania, Sali Berisha, to start hosting a group of Iranian Mujahideens, people who before this, they fought as Fedayeen for Saddam Hussein against the Islamic Republic of Iran. And after in Albania, we have Edi Rama in 2015, installed as a prime minister by George Soros. He's the man of Soros. His wife is or was the director of the Soros Foundation in Albania. In 2016, Albania will become a state hosting of terrorism. What I mean by this is that during the era of the Obama administration, when the Americans will have even the Iran nuclear deal with the Iranian government, the Secretary of State John Kerry in February 2016 will sign an agreement with Albanian government for transferring almost 3,000 Iranian Mujahideens from Iraq to the town of Manza in Durrës, Albania. From 2016 onwards, we will have a new Islamic enemy which will be pinpointed by NATO, Americans, and in particular Israel in the Balkans, and this will be Iran. Now, since the collapse of communism, Iran has been present in the Balkans by supporting the Muslims of Bosnia, the Muslims of Kosovo, and of course, Muslims and Albanians in general. But with the coming of the Iranian Mujahideens and the opening of the Israeli embassy, Israel will do most of what it can to try and convince the countries of the Balkans to get rid of the Iranian influence. But in countries like Albania and Kosovo, a large minority of a large group of the Muslims, they belong to Sufi Islam and some even to Shia Islam. These communities have had historical connections with Iran and with Shiism. But starting from 2016, in Kosovo, in Albania, in Macedonia, the local governments will start to target Iranian-sponsored NGOs and Shia groups. So, if until 2015, the main worry of the Americans in the Balkans will be Sunni Islam, and they will use, in a way, the Gulenists to take over the structure of Sunni Islam in the case of Albania. With the coming of the Mujahideens, there will be an Israeli-American Mujahideen alliance to stop the Iranian influence in the Balkans. In 2018, the Mujahideens, after being relocated to Albania, they will create a paramilitary camp in the town of Manza. From there, around 3,000 Mujahideens, they will direct a war, a cyber warfare, but even a military warfare against the Islamic Republic. While in 2013 and 14, the Americans forced all the Balkan countries to change their penal code, whereby if any citizen of Western Balkans, be him Albanian, Bosnian, Kosovar, Montenegrin, Macedonian, etc., calls for regime change in another country, he will be arrested and jailed as a terrorist. With the coming of the Mujahideens in Albania, we will have a major legal scandal. While the Albanian government is going to jail and arrest and harass hundreds of Albanian Muslims only because some of them will write on Facebook declarations against the Syrian government, or some will simply only complain against Israel, and they will be even jailed if they will write any problematic sentence against Israel. With the coming of the Mujahideens, we will have a huge ex-terrorist army which will establish a paramilitary camp, and from this camp they will openly call for war and regime change in Iran. With the relocation of the Mujahideens, Israel and the Mujahideens, they will manage to, in 2018, force Albania to sever its diplomatic, to expel 2 diplomats from the country, and then in 2022, they will force Albania to even sever its relations with the Islamic Republic of Iran. My time is up. I have to apologize for my poor internet connection. I hope I can explain more during the question time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olsi, and being very interesting, presenting this very interesting conversation, and for good timekeeping, and I really appreciate it. And now we would like to, I would like to move on to the next speaker, Yasser Louati. Yes, Yasser. Yasser Louati is a French political analyst and human rights advocate based in Paris. He's currently head of Committee for Justice and Liberties, a transnational human rights and civil liberties organization. CJL's work is based on production of knowledge, research, investigation, empowerment, and mobilizations and campaigns. Previously, he was a community organizer from Paris, Southside Banlieues, where he led multiple campaigns against racism, police brutality, and mass surveillance. Yasser was also the co-author of European Report on Islamophobia for 2 years. He advised multiple organizations, think tanks, and editors from major outlets on French politics and social movements. He is fluent in French, English, and Arabic, alongside his weekly columns for the New Arab, where he shares his analysis for English-speaking audience. Yasser is also a regular contributor to international news outlets such as BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, and TRT, among others. He can also be heard on his podcasts, Le Breakdown and Les Indeed Libres. Previously, Yasser was a pilot and held management positions in business aviation industry, trained on Cessna citations and Embraer famous of jets. He flew as a captain predominantly in the US and in the MENA region, with responsibilities in aircraft management and pilot training. Thank you very much, Yasser, and the floor is yours. You have 15 minutes.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Just checking that the sound is good. How's the sound? All right. Thank you. So I really appreciate the perspective given by my previous co-panelists, especially when it comes to the political evolution of Europe in terms of how parties are reorganizing around the notion of Islamophobia, how the media is framing Islam and Muslims both as a domestic and international threat, not only at home. It's what I call the triple threat: the threat against national security, national identity, and of course the national economy. In other words, they are taking our jobs, they are threatening who we are as a so-called civilization, and of course they are threatening our lives by their very presence. Now, what the last few years under Emmanuel Macron have shown us that Islamophobia has crystallized the almost the entirety of the political spectrum in France. In other words, you can see that political parties can disagree on topics related to the economy, on how the government should function, but they more or less say the same thing when it comes to Muslims, and even French Muslims who have been here for multiple generations. Now, I like the term of Muslims at the periphery of the West, even though they were central in the development of the so-called West. In the case of France, for example, modern-day France, especially after the Second World War, owes its freedom and economic development to Muslim blood and soil. First, how colonization has contributed and the slave trade have contributed to the massive economic development of Europe after the 15th century and onwards to this day. And it was even more obvious, how it has been this, domination of the African colonies and the colonies in the West Indies and in Asia have also rebuilt France after the Second World War. Now, today, we are speaking in the month of December, and on the 1st of December, we had the massacre of the Tiaroy, the Tiaroy massacre, in Senegal, a small town in the outskirts of Dakar. And what happened on the 1st of December, the tirailleurs Senegalais who were mobilized to free France from the Nazi occupation were massacred by their brothers in arms with whom they were fighting the Nazis. And the reason was that as they were demobilized and sent back home, they asked for their pensions to be paid. And as a third of the pension was paid back in France, the remainder of the sums owed to them was not paid. And because they dared to demand their rights, the white soldiers watching the scene could not take it. And we have testimonies of them bringing massive artillery to shoot and kill those who were protesting. And this went down in history as the Tiaroy massacre. We also have multiple examples of such that France mobilized these people, the formerly colonized, whose descendants are now, born and raised in France and daring to seek equality. When we speak about that, when these people dare to say what is owed to them, they are treated as criminals and massacred. And this is why we call it the Tiaroy massacre. Now, I want to really, focus on present-day France and speak again on how this Islamophobia in France has restructured the political landscape, but also how France, being the laboratory of Islamophobia, has influenced the rest of Europe. Many have spoken about Emmanuel Macron's discourse back in 2020 in Les Mureaux, when he spoke of the so-called anti-separatism. The term, of course, is a new iteration of Islamophobia in France. Before that, it was radicalization, it was communautarism, Muslims refusing to live within, mainstream French society. And of course, Emmanuel Macron had to get into, to innovate on how these Muslims are perceived. He makes his speech about so-called Islamic or Islamist separatism. And in that discourse, he lays out the foundation of an open repression of Muslims. He goes on saying that this so-called Islamist, separatism is a theological political project trying to secede from the rest of France. And in the French context, seceding from, the nation has led to dramatic a military intervention. And he goes on saying that, and this is where it gets even more important for Islamic organizations, especially the religious ones, that laicity should be violated and that the government must be able to intervene in Muslim charities. Now, excuse me, I just had a message. What happened right now is, though laicity for years has been portrayed as a sacred French value that protects the state from religious interference, and that laicity has pacified relations between the Catholic Church and the government, and that by extension it has also protected minority religions, we see that the day laicity was to benefit Muslim minorities in their right to exist as religious communities protected from government meddling, to exist as communities with agency, with capacity to contribute and participate and even disagree and dissent in political debates. Then laicity became problematic because it was, in the beginning, it was a value to protect religious freedom. But since Muslims acquired this laicity for their benefit and the protection of their interests, laicity had to be reinterpreted. And this is exactly what we're seeing today with Emmanuel Macron, that Muslims today cannot exist as citizens. They are welcome to be consumers. They are welcome to stand on the side and watch global events and national events unfold, but they should not dare to take part in those events. And this approach has been laid bare by Emmanuel Macron. For example, dozens of organizations have been raided by the government. Many have been shut down. Some famous ones have been shut down against Islamophobia, humanitarian organizations, etc. And the message being sent, and this is, these are the words of the Minister of Interior, of the President himself, excuse me. Fear should be on their side. We should no longer be afraid. And the message, again, sent by the Minister of Interior to double down on what the President said was that even though we have no legal basis in raiding these organizations and shutting them down and raiding homes and charities and mosques, the goal was to send a message. And this has been completely acceptable for most of the political elite in France. And even on the left, when we have so-called dissenters from Jean-Luc Mélenchon's party, they were against the anti-separatism law. That's a fact, and they should be encouraged for this courageous posture. But even people like Mélenchon voiced their opposition to so-called political Islam. And when we analyze and listen to what politicians have been saying about so-called political Islam, we see what they mean by it is that Muslims existing as citizens, having a say on national affairs, and daring to say no. And this, I got 6 minutes left, and I want to open a bracket of, I would share a window in which I will cover past events and current events. During colonization, by the end of the 19th century, I'm going to use the case of Algeria. The Algerians rose massively against the French occupation. It was triggered for multiple reasons. Of course, their very presence, and it accelerated as the French government was meddling in religious affairs, was meddling in ownership of land, etc. And by the end of the 19th century, the French colonial administration missions Léon Roche, who posed as a friend of Emir Abdel Qadir, the great fighter. Léon Roche obtains a custom-made fatwa from one of the sharifs in the holy city of Mecca, and he gets a custom-made or tailor-made fatwa saying, quote unquote, and this fatwa is actually available in our national archives. The fatwa says there is no reason for Algerians to fight back against France as long as France allows them to pray zakat, and go to Mecca. Which means these indigenous people have the right to exist as believers only. And that is exactly what Emmanuel Macron is applying today. Emmanuel Macron made it clear that anytime, actually Macron and his likes, even including Jean-Luc Mélenchon, anytime these Muslims get political, become active citizens, and even worse, dare to voice their opposition to the dominant narrative, to the government in place, and even to political parties in the opposition, that is labeled political Islam. And that heavily politicized word has allowed the massive repression we are seeing today in France in terms of taking assets from Muslim organizations. About 50 million euros have been taken from Muslim charities in the name of fighting so-called political Islam. Many activists and public figures saw themselves crucified in the public sphere because they dare to call out Islamophobia, call out the government, and because of their background, their name being Muhammad or whatever, they get labeled as agents of political Islam, and they get, of course, disqualified. And to further instill fear in the hearts of people who would be tempted to stand against this open repression, we see that a term called Islamo-gauchism was coined. Now, many people think Islamo-leftism comes from France. No, it comes from the UK. It was theorized as an alliance between the left and Islamic organizations against capitalism, etc. But in the case of France, Islamo-gauchism or Islamo-leftism was applied towards any person who would dare to call out Islamophobia, who would support post-colonial, decolonial studies, etc., and who would have a say framing racism as a political issue and not a moral issue. And that, of course, worked because many people in academia, in political parties, in the news, were scared of calling out and voicing their opposition to state-sponsored Islamophobia that materializes, again, in shutting down or actually breaking any platform Muslims might have to be political, but also to make it impossible for them to organize against this repression. Now, in the 2.5 minutes that I have left, I just want to step back and show how this French-manufactured narrative and French-manufactured approach towards Muslims has been exported abroad. Right after France passed the anti-separatism law, it lobbied the European Commission, it lobbied the European Parliament, and an axis was developed between Paris, Brussels, and Vienna to tackle so-called, again, political Islam, which are, if it wasn't clear, has never been defined, but is applied against individuals Western governments deem as problematic Muslims who don't want to be subservient and obey the dominant narrative. We saw that line being used in Austria. Dozens of Muslim figures were raided over there. And we are seeing now the narrative, manufactured in France about separatism being applied in Sweden, a so-called liberal country where everybody is happy, and a so-called pacified society right now being governed by an alliance where the Sweden Democrats, a neo-Nazi, neo-fascist party that has polished its appearance, has pushed for policies targeting Muslims. If you take the declaration of policy by the government, it speaks of so-called separatism. It speaks about shutting down Muslim schools. And today we are seeing the Swedish government following the footsteps of the French government in tackling so-called separatism. Now, in conclusion, just to say a few words about the state of affairs in France and the West. The situation for Muslims is catastrophic. And now, if it is, of course, obvious that the problem is coming from Western governments, it is on Muslims themselves in the West and as Western Muslims to redefine their position as citizens with agency and Islamic roots. What is their position in the West? How do they define themselves? Do they define themselves as citizens or only believers? And this will actually bring back the question of what kind of Islam is to be practiced. The Islam that is practiced in many countries where Islam is subservient to the government, or where Islam is a force for change and freedom. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yasser, for this very interesting talk and timekeeping. You just finished actually 2 seconds early. Thank you very much. Now, I'd like to give the floor to Arzu Merali because Professor Marandi is not able to make today, so Arzu is filling in. She's a writer. Arzu Merali is a writer and one of the founders of the Islamic Human Rights Commission. She's currently editing their quarterly magazine, The Long View, alongside Faisal Bode. Floor is yours, Arzu.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I can only apologize for people who are expecting Professor Marandi. I am not an adequate alternative, and I will do my best. I'm just catching up with these issues in the last minute. So this year was the 25th anniversary of the founding of IHRC, which is why I wanted to emphasize that in my bio. And well, you know, maybe it's a false anniversary, but it's been some time for reflection for myself as one of the people who was there from the beginning. And listening to the presentations both today and yesterday evening from Professor Ramon, and I must thank everyone. They've been absolutely superb and really opened up a space, which is what we really want, to discuss issues which otherwise, and I think Yasser touched upon this very nicely, and actually also even Olsi, where Muslims have been increasingly forbidden, literally by the law, to discuss and to speak about. Now, going back those 25 years when IHRC was set up, I was recalling that we used to talk about things like, and feel that we were part of something called the global Islamic movement. And I mean, I'm smiling, and I think a lot of people watching would even smile. Some of them with affection, some of them quite cynically, some of them may just think I've used a really weird phrase because they're quite young, and it's not something you talk about anymore as far as I'm concerned, or as far as I know. Maybe I'm just very old and I hang around with the wrong people, I don't know. But that idea of a global Islamic movement became a something in the wake of the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979. And I bring it up for this reason, because listening to these presentations and just kind of ruminating on my own thoughts, there are two central issues in my mind about how we discuss Islamophobia at this current moment with regard to a kind of worldwide geopolitical conversation, as opposed to what I'm very used to, talking about Islamophobia in Western domestic settings, okay? And that is this dichotomy, or a couple of dichotomies. One is between the idea of what we need to do to survive, whether that's as highly oppressed minoritized communities in the westernized situation, of which I've spoken about a lot, and I disagree with a lot of my peers in civil society about a lot in terms of approach. And secondly, about narratives of liberation. And I think we've heard a lot about the kind of alliances we need to survive. João's picked up on it, Ramon spoke about it yesterday. I mean, sometimes they are going to leave a very bitter taste in the mouth because they're based on survival and necessity rather than coming together of liberatory thinking or solidarity, etc., etc. Be that conversations with China, alliances with Russia, or other scenarios, particularly going on in West Asia in the current last decade. But the idea of liberation, something that was very central to this idea of global Islamic movement, right? That to me seems to be something that we were struggling to hang on to, and maybe even in recent years have almost completely lost. And I think when we are talking now about the opportunity of this moment, which I think no one disagrees with, except perhaps, well, in fact, I don't think even anyone in the kind of public intellectual think tank community in the US would disagree, the kind of waning of unipolarity around the US. We have this space to, if not necessarily escape immediately, but to start creating another world. But we seem to have lost, as Muslims, the ability to speak about liberation through our own terms or possibly our own ideas. And this takes me back to the central question of the conference, which is, are there shifts in Islamophobic thinking, given that there are shifts in the state of the world at the moment, this move towards multipolarity. And so I want to flag up a couple of questions based on what we've been listening to in the last couple of days, and maybe we can unpack them more because my colleagues would be much better suited to answer them than myself. One is this idea of about how Islamophobia was instrumentalized in foreign policy, particularly by the US, but by extension, various Western countries. There is a sort of conversation about when that started, and there's a lot of, well, this became a thing after 9/11. This is the war on terror, and it has shifted. We heard about it last night. We're no longer in the moment of the war on terror. That kind of discourse has dissipated into a shift towards Russia and China, or China. In terms of, sorry, I'm just looking at my notes now. Other arguments, you can go back and say, well, okay, hang on a minute, Willy Klaus was talking in 1995, then Secretary General of NATO, that actually we are looking at Islam as the next big thing. This is as bad as communism. We have to kind of tackle it. This is our new Cold War, or hot war, as it turned out. But did it start in 1995 also? This is at the end of the Balkan Wars, not at the beginning, okay, where you have President Clinton writing in his memoirs that whilst he was pushing for some kind of resolution in Bosnia, you had European countries really not wanting to assist, or in some cases actively breaking the aspirations of a nation state in Bosnia based on the idea that they did not want a quote unquote Muslim state in the European area, right? Is that the start of Islamophobia? I think not. I think we're looking back even further. I think even if we said it was 1979 and Iran, and there's a lot to be discussed about how that's the real starting point of the current era, we can go back forever and ever and ever. I sort of want to challenge all of us to think that whether the US is no longer a player, the discourse, the Islamophobic discourse that has existed in some form or another, popping up here, there, and everywhere, because ultimately, if you're looking in the Balkans, the discourse is not coming purely from the West, it's also coming from the East. It's coming from a kind of, for want of a better word, Slavic Islamophobia, as opposed to the British or US versions. The space that's now opening up leaves us very vulnerable to these unchallenged types of Islamophobia. I'm not even going to unpack China because I don't have time. What is it we can be doing now to talk about liberation, not just as Muslims, because I think part of the issue of the idea of the global Islamic movement was that we were often talking simply about Muslims without a kind of nuanced or, we were all very young, at least I was once upon a time, looking at actually the reality on the ground, which is that we don't live in silos and blocks, okay? We live in multicultural, cosmopolitan societies, and we always have. And how does Islam as a political, social, and economic narrative fit into that in the current moment? So how do we bring that back as part of the conversation, and we do not just sit in a kind of repeating cycle of, at best, second or third in the hierarchy of an alliance that is more of the same, but of a different color or flavor or slightly different culture, and actually start working towards alliances and movements where narratives of liberation play a role. Not being naive here, I'm not saying we do nothing, we don't work with any of these countries because of X, Y, Z, or that we can only sit and talk about, the grand scheme of Islamic economy and not be involved in the changing, the changing economic world order, if you like. But does that mean we have to sit up and shut up and be quiet? I think that is where I want to sort of leave it. I have a lot of notes, but this has already been a bit of a stream of consciousness, and I don't want to kind of take up too much time without having a succinct or plausible conclusion, if you like, because this is something that I don't have an answer to. I've been struggling with it for a long time, and I don't know what the solution is here. I don't know what to even suggest as a way forward. I need people who are better versed in this to at least be having this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arzu, for filling in for Professor Marandi and sharing your thoughts with us about Islamophobia and reflecting your experience. And I'd like to thank everyone for this very rich conversation. I think we had some technical difficulties, but overall we had very interesting points about the different geopolitical regions, on the Islamophobia and the Muslims and the role of Muslims in the conflict. Now I'd like to open the floor for questions, and Yasser Louati had to leave for some arrangements that he had to leave, so he won't be participating in the questions and answers, but Olsi and João and Arzu will be here and taking questions. If you have any questions, you can post them on the comment section, and we are also receiving some other questions. And I like to keep it as a kind of also conversation between this panel speakers, because some parts of the presentations were intersecting. I think there might be some conversation there and comments, and so I would like to start. There's a question in the comments for Olsi. So the question is, what role do you think Croatia and Serbia will play with regard to Balkan Muslims in the near future? Olsi, if you would like to answer to this question.
Well, I do not know if, Croatia and Serbia will have any major role if the process of the Europeanization progresses, because what we are witnessing in the Balkans, we are witnessing the end of the nation state and the end of local nationalisms. So if the process of Europeanization progresses as it is now, we will no longer have Serbian and Croatian nationalism with their anti-Turkish and anti-Muslim myths. But nowadays, a challenge that we are facing is the process of de-religiosization, the LGBTization of our communities, and in a way, the total removal of the Islamic identity from the identity of the Muslims in the Balkans.
Thank you very much. I'd like to have a question. The others can also, I think, will be with us. João, I have a question for you. I also read your presentation yesterday. It's very interesting. What I understood is that you're very careful not to make that this so-called conspiracy, theory, because you are making clear that, of course, there is the conflict. You are not undermining that. You are not diminishing it. But what it seems is that or what I understand from your paper and your presentation, you are saying that there is a parallel system, like people or certain countries, certain powers, especially the Western powers, they have their own agenda, they have their own interests to take care, and sometimes they might seem to be engaged in a conflict, but this is just as a show, a kind of show. It's everything is about preserving their power and influence. And for example, the example of China is the new enemy. Nevertheless, they have all these trade connections and mutual interests, because West needs cheap labor to keep their consumerism and of course a lot of production and related economic benefits. So they need China, although they are presenting China as the new enemy, yet they have very strong ties that they can't just get rid of. But does that mean like everything is just an illusion, that some things are not, that we, you know, we cannot come out of this illusion, or there is this grand plan that is taking place and we have no power over that grand plan, so we can just watch it, and or we can, you know, what is like really the core of your presentation or your paper in that sense? What's your point of view? Can you please a little bit clarify that?
Thank you so much. So let me just first say that it's obviously a bit of a big task to present the information which I did. In terms of solutions, I present very few in the paper, apart from fighting sectarianism in a really, really aggressive way. Because I think that if you notice, some of the most disastrous geopolitical events for Muslims have come from foreigners taking advantage of inherent sectarianism, right? I think Syria and Iraq has driven that point home. It's also augmented sectarianism, but those who are, let's say, who have presence of mind can see that strategically it has to be one of the things that we have to do. Secondly, I do propose the urgency of an alliance, okay? So a type of Islamic alliance, which is just in the field of real politics, if you will. But obviously, I think it's not necessarily feasible at the moment, but we definitely have to start thinking about it, right? I think Arzu really mentioned something really important, which is that it has to be founded based. We have to obviously also increase a sense of actual cultural solidarity amongst Muslims globally. But at the end of the day, sometimes the disasters that we're faced with demand not only calls for unity. I think they have to be there, but we have to take it upon ourselves to be as pragmatic, or even more so, than our enemies. In regards to your comment regarding this sort of kind of conspiracy, like, well, this is just how policy works, right? So the word conspiracy, I'm really not afraid of it. A conspiracy usually is just a plan undertaken in secret by two or more people, right? So even corporations work in a conspiratorial kind of manner. If you have a job that's the least bit sensitive, you'll sign a non-disclosure agreement, right, before you have any kind of information. For example, I work for technology companies. It's, you know, any little mishap in sending perhaps, you know, information regarding to one customer to another might get you fired. Imagine what happens in the field of politics. So in regards to the geopolitical alliances, I think my Chinese example was a paradoxical one, because I'm proposing this scenario that we have to look out for. And then I also say that whether the scenario comes into place or not, it already exists in the form of NATO. And I think it's very interesting how it was a common theme also across Olsi's presentation, right? So NATO supposedly, you know, the big and this is just to answer your question quite directly, Seyfeddin. I mean, look at the example of NATO. Look what their stated objectives are, but look who they're actually bombing. This is the best example I could possibly give you. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization. We have to stop communism. We have to stop them in their tracks. I'm not saying that NATO does not have a huge role in the contention of Russia as well. But at the end of the day, the bombs drop mostly on the Muslims and not on the Russians. Now, I'm not asking for the Russians to be bombed, obviously, but I'm pointing out facts.
I'm glad that you are not.
Their words are pointed at Russia, but their bombs are pointed mostly at Muslims, and we have to take our conclusions from that. So insofar as that, let me give you an example. George W. Bush, and this is just to give you a little example of how these little deals happen, of how extreme it is that these deals happen in the background in the world of real politics. So we have George W. Bush, who was central in the invasion of Iraq, the second invasion of Iraq in 2003. His dad, George H.W. Bush, also, as you know, participated in one invasion of Iraq, 1991. You'll be interested to know that his dad, so George W. Bush's grandfather, was Prescott Bush. Prescott Bush is known to have had business dealings. He was involved in business dealings with the Nazis. IBM, International Business Machines, which is an American technology company, was the one providing the technology that the Nazis used to identify Jews in concentration camps, okay? And this is when they were already at war. This is how extreme it gets sometimes, okay? So imagine in the current scenario we have, right? So a lot of these conspiracies and kind of, they have, and it's just, and all my presentation was basically geared at saying, these conflicts are real. These rivalries are real. This enmity is real between the West, Russia. This is all very real. And I wish, and if I'd taken a little bit more time to talk about some of the kind of the details of those. But insofar as, and going back a little bit to what Arzu said, these are important issues. But if we place ourselves as Muslims thinking geopolitically, we have to be a little bit cold here, okay? And we have to realize, even though they may on occasion be enemies amongst each other, really they're more consistently enemies to us, right? And there's several instances of that. So I hope I will have answered somewhat your.
Thank you very much. Yes,
not in
you
content,
did.
then in tone and attitude, right? So,
Yes,
but I
yes.
do understand that it is a macro narrative, and it is it does rely on specific examples, but it's just really for us to look out, like, don't take your eyes off the ball, kind of thing, right? So
Thank you.
China,
Yeah,
US, this is all real,
bigger
but
picture.
we have to get our
I
own
think
program as
that's
well, right? We
You're-
need to have our own program, and our own program has to be based on aggressively fighting sectarianism and internal divisions, and aggressively campaigning for Islamic alliance proper, non-aggression pacts between Islamic countries, and some kind of pact that says if you attack one Islamic country, then we'll aid them. Okay, it has to. This is how. I'm sorry. This is how NATO operates.
Very optimistic. Very optimistic.
It doesn't matter. It's through the will of God, everything's possible. And
yes,
in the medium to long term,
Muslim countries, I think, if you leave them to themselves, they would they destroy each other. You know.
I understand. I know that all too well.
More willingly than in any other power, any other foreign power. Anyways.
And in my paper, I do mention the virulent, for example, anti-Shia sentiment of ISIS, etc. So I completely agree with you. But reality changes very quickly. I mean, look what happened during the Second World War. I mean, so enemies can become so, and we have a tool that nobody else really has, which the West could have, and we have the Quran, and we have Islam around which to unite. This is something that no one in the world has today, to the extent that we have. We have the inherent potential for unity. The reality is completely opposite. We're perhaps the most divided, the most brutal with each other for now, as it stands now. But through the will of God, we can change it, and the future could be very, very different. That is my belief.
Thank you very much. I have one question for Olsi and one question for Arzu, and then afterwards I'll move on to the comments that coming from the viewers. Olsi, sorry, you've been talking about this like MKO or other like Al Qaeda, these like groups, certain groups who have tendency to violence and lack of. They don't have, they have disregard for many human values, not even like religious values. I'm talking about general values. So they can go very violent and they can go out of control. Nevertheless, Western powers, democracies, when they are in tune, they find a common interest with these groups. They are not hesitant to use these very violent and very barbaric groups, and it has been happening for a very long time, and throughout the history in the 21st century. Yet still we don't learn any lesson. They don't learn any lesson, and especially in the Balkans, in that region now, we see that MKO is there, and this is a very violent group, and we know the history of that group. Do you think that this group could also evolve into, if like at certain point then the common interest ends, so this group is left to itself, and could it pose a threat for that region, for Muslims in that region, not just for Muslims but non-Muslims in that region? Could it be a dangerous group in the long run?
MKO is a very dangerous group, apart from being danger for Iran and Muslims. It is a danger to itself. I study MEC since 2016. I have interviewed many of their defectors, and they do is that they practice slavery, a modern form of slavery. It is great opinion, the Council of Europe, human rights organizations, and what have you, that they are saying nothing about what MEC does in Albania. In 2018, I was invited at the European Parliament, where I gave my testimony about MKO and what they do to their members and how they attack Albanian politicians, journalists, and others. Am I being followed, or am I again offline? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I mean, this is my problem today with the internet. Can you hear me now?
Can I come back to you?
I'll
speak to
going.
Yeah, you just wait. Maybe it might come back. I'll come back to you to give you a chance to answer the question. But we don't have much time. Just 5 more minutes. So 5 more minutes. I'll come back to you, Olsi. Maybe it might get better, your connection. We don't have much time now. I'm gonna ask Arzu, instead of my question, I'm gonna ask a question from the viewers, and I have time at the end, and I'll ask my question to you. So there's a question for João. Do you see China talking on the role of Russia? Sorry, taking I took off my taking on the role of Russia versus US in the balance that you mentioned?
Absolutely. So the whole concept, part of the big, the concept of the, part of the concept of the Northern megastates, I think there's a kind of echo. Maybe someone is, yeah, there's a little bit of an echo ongoing. So basically, part of the concept of the Northern megastate is I basically do talk about the tensions between Russia and the West, but I also basically do use the case of China, basically saying there have been kind of Cold Wars, or let's say these Orwellian wars between China, but that does not mean that trades can happen. And I do say, I try to use that as an example of a convergence that can happen that can seem to be unthinkable. And that would have been unthinkable. I mean, imagine in the 60s or 70s, to think that US would come to be so dependent on China. It would be unthinkable, and yet here we are. And so I'm using the example to basically say, though it may seem effectively like Russia and Western Europe are mortal enemies, it may change, and precisely because of the case of China, and I did mention that. And I do think that the fear of China, and not only of China, we have Indonesia with a huge potential. We have India with a huge potential. We have even Brazil with a very interesting potential. So there are a lot of powers. Turkey has so Iran is a force to be reckoned with as well, despite them not being that large and not having that larger population. They punch above their weight. So I think that the fear, I think eventually this fear might push Russia and the West into each other's hands, if you will. I'm not saying it will happen anytime soon. And let me just say something in regards to trying to answer this question at the same time while kind of answering to a comment you made, Seyfeddin. Let's remember that even though obviously it sounds a little bit ridiculous when I talk about these Islamic alliances coming to being, as Muslims, we have to have not only a long memory, we need to leave ideas and visions for the generations to come. We can't only operate on a short-term thinking. We are a religion that has, let's say, a lengthy history, but we have a rich future as well, surely. So even if it seems unthinkable to our generation, we need to leave these visions very clearly as paths forward for the generations to come, and hopefully someone will be inspired and capable of actually doing it. In regards to the China question, absolutely. I absolutely think that sooner or later, the fear of China, just like I saw this brilliant interview by compulsive liar and war criminal Tony Blair, and he was basically talking up. He was just yapping about how the European Union, he was basically anti-Brexit. It was during the Brexit debate, and he was yapping on about how the European Union is great, democracy, blah blah blah. And at one point, he just stops the interview. He says, "Look," it's very simple. China is more than 1 billion. India is more than 1 billion. Each of our countries in Europe, we only have about like 80 million maximum in the case of Germany. We need to unite, and if we do, we're 400 million. Right? So the logic of the European Union started very much as an economic alliance, but I can guarantee you there's always been a geopolitical thinking behind it, thinking paradoxically before, it was divisions between Europe that allowed for colonialism, right? So European powers couldn't necessarily take each other on. I'm Portuguese, I know all about that. We couldn't necessarily invade Spain, so we invade other people's countries. So it was the disunity and rivalries between European countries that kind of allowed for this huge expansion. But now European powers realize that they either unite or they will become irrelevant. And that is a key component of the logic between the European Union. And I think this logic will be extended to Russia in the medium to long term. I'm not saying it will happen, but it's a scenario that we have to take into account. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just going to give Olsi a chance to answer the question.
Yeah, I'm sorry for my internet.
Oh, Olsi is
using my
Olsi,
phone.
maybe if you turn off your camera, just speak. That might work.
Okay, now can you hear me now?
Yeah, very good, very good.
All right, I'm sorry, I'm using my phone. I don't know what to do with this connection. So,
Okay.
I mean, coming back to MEC, MEC is a very dangerous cult, and they are dangerous apart from being for Europeans and for Iranians. First of all, they are dangerous for themselves. I have interviewed and I have researched a lot about MEC, and I know very horrible stories from their members themselves. I have given my testimony in 2018 at the European Parliament about what they do to their own members, and they are really horrible. Now, MEC, the Mujahideens, they are a cult, they are terrorists, but for the time being, they are the good terrorists. So they are like Jabhat al-Nusra, who were the good terrorists of Great Britain, of United States, of Turkey in 2013, 2014, and they were needed by the West. Now, what will happen with the Mujahideens in the future? I mean, they're going to be useful to the NATO alliance and Israel for as long as they fight against their home country. We all know that until 2013, the Mujahideens, they were listed as the terrorists by many Western governments, but when they understood that they could be used by Americans and Israel against Iran, they were delisted. They are a very dangerous cult. Albania made a major mistake to host them, but our Prime Minister, who by the way is a good friend to Tony Blair, agreed to host them as a condition for the Americans to allow our Prime Minister Edi Rama to steal the elections. Albania is a major drug trafficking country in Europe, and for you guys who are from the United Kingdom, you probably have seen in the news what is happening with the Albanians. I mean, we're mass invading the United Kingdom because there is an economic desperation in Albania, and our Prime Minister Edi Rama agreed to host them in order to appease the Americans. They are a ticking bomb. The best scenario for them will be, I mean, if Iran takes them out, like the Russians took out the Azov battalion in Ukraine, or if the Europeans or the Americans will reach some kind of deal with Iran, and they will be de-radicalized, and their leaders, like Mariam Rajavi, will end up like Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi or other leaders of ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra. Or a good option for them will be if the Americans will order the Albanian government to implement its anti-terrorism law and forcefully de-radicalize them and jail them for their illegal activities that they do from within Albania. But something that we have to mention in our Muslim European context about the presence of MEC is that for our viewers who probably have no idea who the Mujahideens are, they're diehard anti-Islamists. They hate Islam. If one of you will read the 10 points of Mariam Rajavi, the major ideology of the Mujahideens is the fight against political Islam. They want, their aim is to de-Islamize Iran, to destroy the institution of the Vilayat al-Faqih, and to separate Iran. In her 10-point manifesto of Mariam Rajavi, she has pledged to the American and European leaders that if she is supported to come to power, she will give autonomy to all the different ethnic groups in Iran, and in a way she has undertaken to implement the new Middle East project that the Americans tried to do in Iraq and in Syria by separating and destroying the Muslim nation states and creating small Bantustans. Something else that is very important about the ideology of Maryam Rajavi is, like she has even told to many British parliamentarians, is they are loyal to Israel and Zionism. Maryam Rajavi tells to American, to Canadian, we had Stephen R. Harper coming to Albania in a number of occasions, and to British politicians that if Maryam Rajavi comes to power in Iran, there will be no more support for Palestine, Hamas, Hezbollah, and Islamic Jihad. So in few words, the Mujahideens, they are sectarian cult, anti-Islamic, and Zionist. I hope.
Okay. Thank you very much. No, yes, you answered my question. What I was worried about, of course, they are dealing with the Iran, or it's something else. It doesn't concern Balkans or Albanians, but I'm just thinking, because what we had the examples of, like Al-Qaeda or other groups, they start as good allies, but then the mutual interest ends and they are left to themselves, and they have this kind of dangerous ideology that afterwards you don't know what they are capable of doing in the region or the area that they live. So it might be destructive for the Albanians. So that was my concern, and you answered that. Thank you very much. And I have an yes, Arzu, I'm gonna ask you, maybe if you want to comment on this issue, but also I wanted to ask you, you just reflected on the Islamophobia, or we can add also anti-colonialism. We had the examples of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. There was some progress made in the sense that we understood that the Western interference is no good for these kind of Middle Eastern countries, because in the end it brings more bloodshed, more destruction. But then do you find it more like a little bit depressing, because now we have these regime change calls in Iran? Of course, it's okay that people there are some legitimate grievances of kind of injustices being done, starting from an event or incident. And it's of course, people have right to express their grievances and peaceful demonstration and in other forms. But calling like all-out war, bombing, regime change, and which probably will come with the package of going there and helping Iranians to liberate them, and as they try to do in Afghanistan and Iraq. So do you find it a little bit depressing that we are still, after making so much progress on Islamophobia, anti-colonialism, now we still have these, not just, of course, Western media, I'm not talking about BBC, The Guardian, but also in the Muslim media as well. They seem to have learned no lesson, like, sympathizing with grievances or people, Iranian people some section of Iranian people, they don't like this certain practices, certain laws, which is fine. And I'm sure that, they'll resolve it among themselves at some point, but calling out like all these regime change and interference, what do you think on this?
Seyfeddin, we've known each other a long time. I'm usually almost always depressed, but actually on this point, as frustrating as it has been, and it has been really, really frustrating looking at the narratives around what's been happening in Iran, or perceived to be happening in Iran in the last 6-7 weeks. I think there's a little chink in the armor here, and I think it is to do with lessons learned, not perhaps necessarily by Muslims. You're right. I see a lot of Muslim media jumping on a really deeply Islamophobic bandwagon, and I think this was my point earlier. This has been sort of haunting me since it started, which is that, as you said, people have a right to protest, and the tragic death of somebody in police custody is something that has to always be protested about, even when after a proper inquiry it's seen that there's no fault to be had there by the authorities. That still should be an inquiry, and there still should be the right to protest. But this is not something that, frankly, has been part of the narrative even from the get-go. It has been a kind of relentless tirade against hijab. And yes, it's dressed up as this is about hijab laws, but ultimately, in any other country, we would not be having that conversation about the dress. We would either be having a conversation about a death in custody and police brutality, which is one we question. I'm in the UK. We haven't had one here for the death that happened just a few weeks before of Chris Kaaba at the hands of the police being shot dead here, an entirely innocent man. We've not had that type of liberation call of Azadi in the UK. But going back to the way Muslims themselves are talking about Iran, this is at best kind of defensive, and women have a right to choose, etc., etc., etc. We are living in such a kind of Islamophobic moment that nobody is even thinking about the fact that that is not really what should be part of any conversation. We have dress laws in every single country in the world. Most of them discriminate against women because men are allowed to wear less clothes than women. Not all of them, but most of them. Okay, if we're going to have that conversation about the oppression of women, the coercive control of their bodies, and there is a conversation to be had, let's have it. But why are we focusing on Iran? Why are we focusing on a country which, after the revolution, has had a massive improvement in women's rights? Like massive, from the kind of go to the UN statistics, go to the 95 statistics, go to the 2015 statistics. It doesn't matter. There's been year on year massive, massive gains from a positivistic feminist discourse, right? But we're not talking about that. We're focusing on dress and a specific type of dress, and it's all to do with Islamophobic narrative, right? It completely obscures anything, any kind of legitimate protests and grievances and discourse that's going on in Iran. It's almost entirely external. And that depresses me, not because the usual suspects are saying this stuff. I don't hold out much hope for even sort of the Guardian or the kind of liberal left, but people who should know better. And that little chink of hope that I see is sadly, as I said, not so much from the Muslim press, but I have seen people who originally maybe did jump on that bandwagon, taking a step back because they can now decode it. They can now see, well, actually, by jumping on that bandwagon, I am jumping on the let's bomb Iran, let's regime change. This is the same disaster all over again. It's not enough, but it's a start. What I'm really hoping is that Muslims get some kind of courage and we can get out of this kind of either the myopia or the internalization of Islamophobia that we've kind of been suffering from for decades now, or the fear that we feel about talking about this. If I'm perfectly honest, this is the first time I'm talking about it openly. I haven't said anything in 6-7 weeks, and I don't really have an excuse. So I don't know if I'm taking up all the time of the panel.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
That's it.
Yeah. Said, do you want to ask any questions to the panel, or do you want to make any comments, general, like any of the things that we've covered?
First of all, I want to thank both really excellent keynotes for elucidating some of the very issues that we were hoping to examine when it came to looking at Muslims in the periphery of the West. And I think one of the things that is abundantly clear is that the West is not retreating; it's relocating its assets and its strategies. I think that perhaps something that we can consider is when we're looking at. I think there was a question in the comments about China, and I know China has been mentioned a few times already. And even in yesterday's really excellent lecture by Ramon Grossfugel, talking about how many of the Western policies are directed toward China. I think it bears remembering that China and India combined constitute something on the lines of 35% of the world's population. which means that the West sees it as 35% of the world's consumer market. And I'd be interested in hearing, especially from João, how this conundrum is there, that on the one hand, the West, I think, would like to subdue China. And I would say that even its romance with India is ephemeral. It serves as a nice counterweight to China right now. And India certainly is a willing participant in that, perhaps going back to its own colonial Stockholm syndrome of being a main part of the jewel of the crown. But the idea then that this deployment to try to contain, subdue, disrupt the Silk Road, the Chinese project, they still have to contend with the fact that it has a very large and until now willing consumer market. And of course, also having to contend with the fact that China is the manufacturer to the West. Arzu, you mentioned the whole idea about when did this all begin. I think it's instructive to consider that perhaps Islamophobia goes all the way back in some ways to this tension between corporations and sovereign states with the British East India Company. Was the British East India Company gunning for the Mughal Empire because they were Muslim? And if that's the case, then it would be ideological, or was that incidental to the kind of exploitation that was then visited upon the Indian subcontinent? I mean, these are perhaps just maybe more rhetorical questions, or ones that perhaps we can consider. I know we don't have time to explore them. We might need a whole other conference, but that's just where my thinking was from hearing both very excellent observations.
If I could comment 2 minutes.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, do you want to say something, João?
Really quickly, I think thank you so much. That was some amazing insight. The East India, but it's interesting that you find the East India Company, because they were actually, if I'm not mistaken, quite active in the Opium Wars, a case in which the British bombed Chinese ports to make them accept. So the two aren't necessary. I think your observation was brilliant. Let me just say that in my opinion, I think subduing and waging war and trying to dominate a country does not exclude then you dumping your products on them and using it as a consumer market. In fact, sometimes it's a prerequisite for doing so, right? I think sometimes a lot of these invasions that we're seeing towards Islamic countries is precisely when the West sees Islamic countries setting up their own independent organizations. I mean, Saddam wanted to do a gold standard, I think Libya as well. So, and at the same time, let me just comment that nowadays, and Arzu knows that I'm increasingly kind of straying from the left wing's ability to understand the world at all in any kind of rational way. But let me just remind you that even though people look at the Great Reset as a silly conspiracy theory, the truth is that the left and the anti-capitalist movement globally used to contest the WEF in Davos, right? So the World Economic Forum is the one that we know for a single fact has been kind of like the spearhead of economic change in the West for a very long time. And for a very long time, all they were basically ultra-capitalists. But now the WEF is basically trying to get people open to the idea that we may have to move beyond consumer capitalism, which is not to say that capitalism won't have that dimension, but I think it's very clear that the West is pursuing something different now, okay? So it's not to say that they don't want large swathes of population to sell products to. I think my whole concept of the Orwellian war kind of plays into that as well. But I think the way the West is moving is they're going to have a core, this is their vision at least, where, and I'm actually kind of in the middle of this in my own job, so basically they want to build a set core of corporations, what they call stakeholder capitalism. Stakeholder capitalism is basically non-consumer capitalism, whereby a large part of the corporations basically just feed off each other, off leases, okay? I can go into very lengthy detail on how they're trying to do this, and one of the ways they do this is through recurrent revenue, right? So they just sign leases with each other, and because they know that one labor is being automated, so they know for a fact that people can no longer continue to be consumers in the same way if they don't participate in the labor market, and they know that a lot of activities are being automated. Look into, for example, what that Israeli philosopher Harari is always talking about. He's saying, be careful, because we're entering the age, and he's a very important consultant at the WEF now. He says, be careful, because automation means we may be entering the age of the swathes of quote unquote useless people. Not my words, his own, right? So I think that your element is really, really interesting, but I do not think it necessarily contradicts the scenario. I think it plays into it, actually. right? So I thank you so much because I hadn't, and I actually thank you because I had never actually even considered my considerations up to now regarding the kind of WF's plan to go into sort of stakeholder capitalism, which is kind of post-neo-capitalism, which relies less. It's actually, it's a capitalism that relies less on the working class actually having any degree of purchasing power. I think that's what they're going for. But I'd never considered how that actually ties in to geopolitical relations with China and India. So I thank you for opening up that kind of question. I really need to give that some further thought. So thank you. So I've just given you a couple of hints of what I might think, but thank you for that was really quite insightful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. I think this was a very rich panel. We had a very good, interesting conversations, and I'd like to thank the João and Olsi for their excellent presentation. But also I'd like to thank Arzu and Said for putting this together and also contributing to today's panel. And we continue with the panels, and the conference will continue tomorrow as well. And thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.